Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to the organisers for the invitation. It's good to follow the two speakers who've preceded me because their ideas feed into the things I'm going to talk about. But first I should say hello to my colleagues from the East-West Institute, Lata Reddy and Kamesh Bajaris, who've worked with the East-West Institute in New York on international cyberspace issues. My presentation today is a little bit different from what was foreshadowed in the program. The program foreshadowed a presentation on mutual restraint of great powers in cyberspace. This is the same topic, but with a much sharper edge. And to introduce the presentation, I'd like to just propose that we put to one side for the moment the idea of cybersecurity. My presentation is about something very, very different. It depends in part on cybersecurity, but it's about national security in cyberspace, which is a much larger proposition than cybersecurity. The paper started from a look I was taking at future national security needs of Australia in cyberspace. And I soon realised that, it's pretty obvious to most observers, that the situation of a country like Australia in terms of meeting its national security needs in cyberspace is pretty much the same as the situation of most middle powers. And in fact, there's one cyber great power. It's a cyber superpower, that's the United States. And then we can work out after that where different countries sit in a spectrum or a hierarchy of power. But we can say that middle powers like Australia and perhaps like India in cyberspace really sit in a common position relative to that one great superpower. The second departure point for this presentation was really, if we look forward, how do those national security needs look? And the basic proposition in this paper is that as we look forward, the position of the United States as the sole superpower in cyberspace in terms of military applications is being challenged a little in a 10 to 20 year time frame by China. And I'll go into that in some more detail in the presentation. But another more practical question informs this presentation. If a country like India or Australia, France or Britain needs advanced submarines, advanced fighter aircraft, ballistic missiles and tanks for the possibility of future war, then what do we need in terms of cyber weapon systems and command and control systems for the possibility of war in cyberspace? That's the sort of question that is not often asked by research scholars, so that's what my presentation goes into today. Most people in the audience will be familiar with the book of the title Cyber War Will Not Take Place. I agree with that assessment because the author defines cyber war rather narrowly as war limited largely to cyberspace between computers and computers, code on code, so to speak. It goes with a judgment from Martin Libicki in a RAND report for the United States Air Force, I think in 2011, maybe a bit later, that cyber technologies will not have a strategic impact on warfare, that at best its impacts are going to be operational. Well, I think both of those judgments are correct for the time in which they were presented and the language in which they were presented. But they were really very much about the here and now. And even though the US Air Force commissioned the Libicki paper in terms of future needs of the Air Force, the analysis really didn't look that far ahead. And so I'd really like us to contemplate the questions today in terms of what is the situation in the 10 to 20 year time frame rather than what we know today. And I'd also like us to contemplate the proposition that even if Thomas Rid suggests that cyber war will not take place, I know quite a few governments who are planning on cyber war, so of some form or another. So I think the term cyber war is a little bit misleading. And I really prefer us to use a term like cyber-enabled war, which is really about normal warfare enabled by the massive new potentials of cyberspace. And there are three questions I put on the slide there. I won't read them. You've probably had a chance to look at them. And this is the proposition that in the 10 to 20 year time frame, the relationship between technologies, cost, research and development and deployment for cyber-enabled weapons platforms and cyber-enabled warfare will probably be very, very different from what they are today, and certainly very different from what they were 5 years ago. So that leaves us with the proposition Varun put on the table quite properly, and I agree 100% with the basic proposition. All states are challenged by cyberspace. If they don't adjust to the way in which cyberspace has changed in key dimensions of policy such as military policy, then the inevitable result is a disaster of some kind. Looking at cyber-enabled warfare, we could take the Chinese position or the American position that cyberspace really represents the commanding heights of all warfare. And I'll go into that a little bit later. It's a highly complex phenomenon. As the Pentagon has pointed out, there are 3 layers of cyberspace: physical layer, logical layer, and a persona layer. Bell Labs has pointed to 8 vectors of attack and defense for cybersecurity, but they carry over very well into military affairs, software, hardware, network, payload power, etc. And all this points to the proposition that war in cyberspace, or cyber-enabled war, is a very complex, highly complex matrix of different influences and opportunities. But above all, cyber-enabled war is a political process that serves political objectives, and as Varun was implying, it will impact on all aspects. He didn't say it directly, but it impinges on all aspects of economic, social and military power. So the rest of the presentation really looks at a number of international benchmarks by which countries like India, Australia, France or Britain or Russia might be able to evaluate their future needs for cyber-enabled war, their future needs. So I look in this presentation at China and the United States, not because I've got any particular relationship with either, but because they're obvious examples to choose. One is a cyberspace, superpower in cyberspace, as I've already mentioned. The other is an up-and-coming. But just as importantly, I look also at the question of war avoidance, and this gets back to the questions of mutual restraint, and I tie the question of war avoidance to the chronology of development of the warfighting capabilities of countries like China and the United States. I'd also look at future trends in cyber-enabled war. And here it's very important to understand that what we've lived through in the last 5 to 10 years or 20 years in terms of cyberspace and its military applications will look very different from what it will be in the 10 to 20 year time frame. If a national defense department wants to prepare for cyber war, it's no good going back to what people were saying in 2005, 2010, or even perhaps the 2012 IDSA report. We have to have a very big forward look at what the technologies look like, what the opportunities and potentials look like in that planning. So I'll go into that somewhat. And the value of that sort of benchmarking is that it enables us to critically evaluate where we're now at. You're all familiar with it, so I won't dwell on why we do benchmarking. Let's move quickly to China. And the key thing here is that China has been developing very slowly its information warfare, its capability to fight a cyber-enabled war. So in 2003 it made the first formal shift to a strategy that was premised on quote-unquote conditions of informatization. But it was only in 2014 that President Xi said that China needs to become a cyber military power. In September 2014 he called for a military strategy for the information age, and in 2015 he got it. And in China's first military strategy with that name, there is a very important phrase: outer space and cyberspace are the commanding heights of all international security competition. This is a fundamental tenet for the Chinese government. It's expressed differently, a fundamental tenet for the United States government. I know no other government in the world who has accepted that view. So it'd be interesting to sort of contemplate. We can go into the detail of that perhaps some other time, but it's important to note that China is only weakly developed in cyber warfare capability at the moment, cyber-enabled warfare. It may be good at cyber espionage, but it's really only at the beginning phase. But I would estimate that by 2020 or 2025, China will have an initial joint force and civil sector cyber attack capability of a moderate kind. If we look at the United States, the story is very different. So the United States is definitely the pace-setter country, and some of the milestones of cyberspace policy are there. And contrary to popular belief, although this point is debated in some circles, the first cyber attack in war occurred in 1999 when the United States Air Force used an attack on the industrial control systems of Belgrade electricity grid to put out the lights during nighttime bombing. So it's not new, it has happened, it's already happening. But we need to take note that 2015 was a very big year for cyberspace military developments in the United States. The author of one of the papers is sitting in the room. That was the new cyber strategy from the Pentagon. But an equally important document issued in 2015 was a document called Beyond the Build by the Commander of Cyber Command, in which he said that the United States Cyber Command had to be able to deliver options at in all phases of operations for the United States Armed Forces, and in other parts of the document that can be interpreted to mean cyber options for commanders at all levels of military operations. And if we look forward, I think that in 2020, 2025, we may see a situation where the United States is actually in a position to choose a cyber before bombs option for some sort of intervention such as those in the Middle East. Varun talked a little bit about the UN process, and what we see is a gradual escalation over the last 10 years of intensity by states to try and come towards some form of mutual restraint in cyberspace. But it's going very slowly, and it's certainly not keeping up with the developments that in cyberspace, cyber-enabled warfare. And I think the remarks of the Air Marshal this morning in terms of the cyber arms race and how he expressed that, I think we have to take note of that. The cyber arms race is definitely on, so we have to try and understand what are the appropriate mechanisms of war avoidance that go with this reality that the cyber arms race is on. But it's really the technological trends in how in the opportunities for cyber-enabled warfare that really present the biggest challenges to middle powers. And everything I've said so far might be interpreted to mean, well, the United States can do it, China can do it, but they're not going to attack us. Well, that in one sense is true, but we should rest assured that both the United States and China are preparing for the possibility of cyber-enabled war, which will include multi-vector, multi-front, multi-theatre, sustained cyber and kinetic attacks on a foreign state. So that has implications for middle powers. I'm not saying that they will do that with malice. I'm not saying that it's likely, but both states are actively planning for it. I'll go into that in just a little bit more detail. So here's a slide from a FireEye presentation to RSA in 2013, which was talking about the broad cybersecurity picture. Well, this is equally true of the cyber-enabled warfare picture. And RSA drew attention to the proposition that in the current world, we are already dealing with coordinated persistent threat actors, dynamic polymorphic malware, which can read the reactions of you as the defender and adjust the attack accordingly, multi-vector attacks and multi-stage attacks. So if this is what the civil sector criminals can do now in cyberspace and some state actors, imagine in 10 to 20 years if a state like China or the United States has decided to launch a war on state B. What does coordinated persistent threat mean? What does dynamic polymorphic malware mean in that instance? Multi-vector attacks, multi-stage attacks and multi-theatre attacks. To illustrate the point, we can look exclusively at the question of critical infrastructure, and the Idaho National Lab in the United States has a very good program in this area, and some of their assumptions about their need for defence in respect of national critical infrastructure are quite important. So they're saying, you can read them there, that we've got to abandon the idea that air-gap systems are protected. They're simply not. Intrusion detection technology is really weak. The dynamic threat is evolving very fast, and we don't have enough people. So what this means is that we're going to be fighting a future cyber-enabled warfare in very complex, disadvantaged positions. Let me just touch on the question of how scenario planning might impact on our understanding of future cyber-enabled war. I don't believe it's unreasonable to postulate a combination of the following types of events that have already occurred. So what I'm talking about is an unlikely event, but in the unlikely event that a powerful cyber actor like the United States or China in the future decided to attack State B, it would include almost certainly elements of this kind. The type of attack we saw in Estonia, it could include an attack on space-based systems, because space-based systems are very important for cyber warfare. And then there's a whole range of different activities that could be included. And what this really means is that in a medium intensity cyber-enabled war of a cyber power against State B, that there will be widespread attacks on civilian assets that support the war effort. So perhaps, as one of the earlier speakers mentioned, there might be a civilian panic. There would definitely be civilian panic because civil infrastructure that supported the war effort would be a legitimate military target. I mentioned before that all of this imposes a need for middle powers to develop vast situational awareness systems that don't exist in most middle powers at the moment. The ability to, in a sense, scale up the sort of situational awareness that now exists in leading corporations in terms of the threat to their systems. But in a sense, you have to map your cyber vulnerabilities across your entire defence force and civil infrastructure before you can begin to have a decision-making system that is adequate for this type of cyber-enabled warfare that I'm talking about. And in a sense, that sort of assessment is made independently of any knowledge or consideration of evolutions in the basic technologies such as quantum computing, C4I-star platforms, or laser-based communication. So if we have some disruptive technology in the next 10 to 20 years, then that might very well have a profound enabling effect on cyber-enabled warfare. So that leaves us with the question. I apologise for the brevity of this presentation. It's really only highlights of a very long 15,000 word paper which I can share with people. So please accept my apology if you're not quite getting the gist of everything I'm saying. But we're arriving now at the guts of the problem. So if that sort of cyber-enabled warfare is something that all middle powers should plan for to some degree, then we have to consider how much to spend on developing that capability. And if we consider that a $1 billion fleet of bomber aircraft might not fly, or a $1 billion fleet of submarines may stop dead in the water because of cyber attack, where it is possible, but it takes a lot of effort to get to that point, then, and if we consider that civil infrastructure in this sort of war will not work, it's a 100% certainty. So even if it's only a possibility that your bomber aircraft might not fly, or that your submarines may stop dead in the water, it's an absolute 100% certainty that key elements in a cyber-enabled war with a major power, your civil infrastructure will not work. So that raises the question, what's a combination of military spending, institutional adjustment, military reform, strategy reform, and diplomacy that we have to develop to meet this developing situation? And I think there's only one option for middle powers, and it's up to each country to decide where they sit in that hierarchy of power. And in emphasizing collaboration here and collective security, I really want to emphasize that I'm talking about something very different from the typical international cooperation we've seen around internet governance or around cybersecurity. If we genuinely face these military threats, we're going to have to begin to work across traditional boundaries of blocks and alliances. And in some respects we're already seeing that. But the idea that NATO can defend itself in cyberspace by itself, no matter how powerful the United States is one that doesn't really stand up on close examination when you look at the role of international critical infrastructure in NATO's security. And the United States State Department commissioned an examination in 2012, I think it was, of which parts of critical infrastructure in foreign countries could be considered critical to United States national security. The list was long. The list for China was leaked in a WikiLeaks cable and included a number of things in China. So as everyone has suggested so far, cyberspace is a global phenomenon. It does disturb the normal rules of international order, so therefore it must, almost by definition, disturb the existing military alliances and blocs. So, what's the answer? Well, on the one hand, I think countries have to prepare their defence forces quite differently. They do have to make the radical jump. The world has changed, and if the middle powers do not adjust their armed forces quickly, if it takes them 3 years to go from an IDSA recommendation for a cyber command to not having it by the end of 2015, then that's a pretty good indicator that the country is moving too slowly to meet the problem. But there is another answer, because at the end of the day, no middle powers will have by themselves the capability to withstand the sort of attack that the two pace-setter countries will be able to deliver in 10 to 20 years. So a very good answer is to work with all states, including the two I've mentioned, who have an equal interest in war avoidance, to build a community of interest around a deeper understanding of what cyber-enabled warfare actually is, at the same time as we build a deeper understanding about how we avoid that best and how we can prepare collectively for that. So it's a big challenge. Thank you for your time. We can discuss later. Thank you.